Some people think there's a difference. Some people don't know if there's a difference, and some people don't think there's a difference at all. So in today's video, I'm going to clarify the difference between a counsellor, psychotherapist, and a therapist. Without wasting time, let's get straight into it. Let's start with a counsellor. So the Google definition for what a counsellor is: a person trained to give guidance on personal or psychological problems. So it's quite straightforward and quite simple. But the main things that I want to highlight from this definition is give guidance and personal or psychological problems, and you'll understand why later. So the reason I'm pointing out giving guidance in the definition is because sometimes people think that counsellors give advice, and that's absolutely not what we do. We give guidance, not advice. And I could do a whole video on why counsellors and therapists do not give advice, and if you'd like that, comment advice in the comment section below. We're not supposed to, and we don't, and that's that. So that's why I'm pointing that out, because in the definition it makes it clear that we give guidance and we don't give advice. So that's also something to keep in mind when seeing a counsellor. You may have been guilty of going to a counsellor and just being like, I want advice, I want to know what I need to do, like what should I do, tell me what to do, how to fix my life and how to fix this issue, and that's just not how it works. So that's something to keep in mind. Counsellors give guidance, not advice. The next thing to highlight is the part of the definition in which says personal or psychological problems. So of course personal problems can include a variety of things like health issues, going through a divorce, friendships, relationships, work stress, wanting personal growth, and so many other things like that. While psychological things could be stuff like dealing with anxiety, working through depression, bipolar, panic attacks, and so on. So in this case, counsellors are trained to give support and guidance in both personal and psychological problems. So that's what you can expect and look forward to when you see a counsellor. Pun not intended. So if that's the definition of a counsellor, what is the definition of a psychotherapist? Well, according to Google, it is a person who treats mental health conditions by verbal communication and interaction. And please note that a psychotherapist is not the same as a psychiatrist. Please keep that in mind. But anyway, back to the definition. Now, I'm not really sure if I completely agree with Google's definition of what a psychotherapist is, because psychotherapists don't treat people. Like, that sounds very clinical. Psychiatrists treat people, definitely, but psychotherapists, we don't treat people. We more so provide help, support, and guidance, like a counsellor. Treating sounds like there's a problem that has to be cured and there's an issue that has to be fixed, and that's not how counselling and therapy works. So we don't treat people. So that's why I'm a bit iffy about that part of the definition. And you know, in counselling and therapy, there's no such thing as a cure or treating somebody. Like, it's very clinical. Of course, in hospitals, in a clinical setting, people can be treated when they're given a diagnosis, but psychotherapists do not give diagnosis in the first place, so we're not treating something. So someone can say they've got depression, but we don't diagnose them and say they have depression and write a prescription for anything. That's not what we do. So that's the part of the definition I'm not quite keen on. But psychotherapists do deal with mental health conditions by verbal communication and interaction. So yes. So the main difference is that psychotherapists here, according to this definition, focus more on psychological or mental health conditions as opposed to personal problems. However, of course, in my opinion, most mental health conditions or psychological issues will normally stem from personal problems anyway. So for example, someone might lose their job, and as a result then they might sink into depression, or they might have anxiety about like how they're going to pay their bills and manage their mortgage. So then they might go to see a psychotherapist about this mental health condition that they're suffering with anxiety, or they've got depression because they lost their job. So the work is a personal problem, it's not a psychological problem, but then it's led to a psychological problem. I don't think you can really separate the two. They intertwine with each other. I don't think you can separate them from each other. But the point being, a psychotherapist focuses more on this mental and psychological side of things than the personal side of things. So this is not to say you can't bring in the personal problems, because a good psychotherapist will want to know what led to the problem, what the root of the problem is. So it's not like you can't talk about the personal stuff, but there's a chance that the focus will be more on like, okay, so what's going on with, you know, depression or anxiety, and how can we work through that? But this is just the small slight difference between a counsellor and a psychotherapist. The definition of a counsellor focusing on personal and psychological problems, whereas psychotherapist definition is more just focused on the psychological and mental health conditions instead of personal problems. But that's not to say that they both don't do the same. So the difference between the two is very minor, and it's all down to the definition. So I would still consider a counsellor a psychotherapist and a psychotherapist a counsellor. but the definitions just differ ever so slightly. So the masters I did was counselling and psychotherapy, so because of that I can say I'm a counsellor and psychotherapist, and the difference is not that much at all. So with these two definitions, I would say they're quite interchangeable in everyday conversation. So now let's move on to the definition of a therapist. And when I've searched on Google, it said a person skilled in a particular kind of therapy, which of course is very vague and is not specifically talking about talking therapy. So I had to look up the definition of talking therapy, because of course with therapy you can have lots of different types of therapists. You can have massage therapists, physiotherapists, all different kinds of therapists. So I had to look up the definition of a talking therapist. So Google AI gave me a definition, and this is what it said. A trained professional who helps people manage their mental health conditions through talking. So once again, this definition is focused on the mental health conditions. And like I said before, mental health conditions stem from personal problems and personal issues anyway. So once again, there's not much difference between the two. There's not much difference between all of them. They all deal with mental health conditions or psychological problems, and those stem from personal problems. So you can't really distinguish and say, like, I'm going to talk about just mental health issues and nothing personal, because it stems from the personal stuff that you go through as an individual, through your life, through interactions with other people, and they lead to that. So this definition is very similar to that of a psychotherapist, and psychotherapist is also similar to that definition of a counsellor. So they're basically triplets, non-identical triplets. The only one that's slightly different by definition is the counsellor one, which specifies that they deal with personal and psychological problems, whereas psychotherapist and therapist focus on the mental health and psychological aspect of things. But I would say overall there's not much of a difference. So I would say the only thing that differs really is then maybe the title of the course that you might study. So you might just do a counselling course, so you can call yourself a counsellor. You might do a psychotherapist course, so you can call yourself a psychotherapist. But overall, like, yeah, if someone says, oh, you're a therapist, but your course was counselling, you can say, yes, I'm a therapist. I think the only thing that really makes a difference is the culture that you're in, the country that you're in, and the language of the country or the people that you're around, and what they know to be a mental health professional that deals with this kind of stuff. Some people call them therapists, some call them counsellors, some call them psychotherapists. So I don't think there's that much of a difference all in all, because overall the training and the knowledge and the skills that are given are quite similar across the board. You might learn different theories and approaches. I think it's more common in America to say therapy or therapist, whereas in the UK we say counsellor or counselling more often. But I think with the rise of social media, more people are calling it therapy, so you're more likely to hear, like, I'm going to see my therapist rather than my counsellor. And they're quite interchangeable terms from day to day. Whether you say a counsellor or a therapist or psychotherapist, you're referring to the same thing. So I hope that gives clarity, and until the next video, enjoy the rest of your day or the rest of your night, depending on where you're watching from. Bye!